And that's how we'll finish the edges. Just like your grandmother taught me, dear.
Before we begin this journey, make sure to subscribe to Tales by Gudo 10 so you never miss a chapter of this dark legend. In a forgotten coastal village, Adanna was a girl who meant nothing until her grandmother's death broke the spell, unleashing a beauty so dangerous it brought a town to its knees. Now she is no longer a victim, she is a weapon, and the tide is waiting. In a small and windy Nigerian coastal village where the ocean waves always crashed loudly against the sharp rocks, a quiet 30-year-old woman named Adanna spent every single day of her life taking care of her elderly grandmother, whose name was Nneoma. This village was a very superstitious place where people believed in old spirits and sea monsters, and because 60-year-old Nneoma spent all her time weaving strange patterns into thick mats and talking to herself, the fearful villagers always whispered that she was a wicked witch who brought bad luck to the land. Adanna did not care about the cruel things the villagers whispered, because to her, the small and dusty cottage filled with the smell of dried herbs and colorful threads was the only safe home she had ever known in her entire life. Adanna herself was completely overlooked by everyone in the village because she had asymmetric features and a face that was covered in rough scars from a childhood sickness. And her hair was always dull and dry, which made it very easy for her to move through the marketplace without anybody ever paying attention to her. One exceptionally dark and quiet night, the heavy air in the cottage grew completely still, and Nneoma passed away very peacefully in her sleep, while her old, wrinkled hands were tightly clutching a mysterious blank silver mirror that had no reflection at all. Just before she breathed her very last breath into the cold night air, Nneoma opened her eyes wide and looked at her granddaughter with great urgency, squeezing Adanna's hand tightly as she delivered a final, breathless warning that echoed through the quiet room, telling her to hide her face from the tide. Adanna wept all through the night because her heart was completely broken by the loss of her only protector. But when she finally woke up the morning after Nneoma's death, she immediately felt a strange and intense burning sensation that felt like fire rushing directly beneath her skin. She stumbled over to the wash basin to splash cool water on her face, but when she happened to catch her reflection in the water, she gasped loudly and fell backward because she could not recognize the person staring back at her at all. All of her asymmetric features and her deep childhood scars were completely gone. Her dull hair had transformed into thick, glowing coils that seemed to hold the light, and she realized that she had suddenly become painfully and breathtakingly beautiful in a way that did not look human. Grief-stricken, but knowing she had to be strong, Adanna covered her head with a simple wrapper and walked into the busy village marketplace to arrange for her grandmother's funeral. But the moment she stepped onto the dusty road, a terrible silence fell over the entire crowd. Instead of complimenting her new appearance or offering words of comfort for her loss, the fishermen and the market women simply stared at her in absolute paralyzed terror, as if they were looking at a ghost. The local dogs began to howl and whine in deep fear as she passed by them, and Adanna felt her heart pounding wildly in her chest as she realized that her strange transformation was intensifying with every single step she took into the frightened town. Adanna hurried back to her grandmother's cottage as fast as her legs could carry her, but she quickly discovered that her new appearance possessed a hypnotic and predatory effect that completely stripped away the free will of every person who looked upon her face. When her greedy landlord came to the house to demand the monthly payment, he stopped dead in his tracks the very moment Adanna looked at him, and he instantly forgave her entire rent while staring at her with hollow, unblinking eyes that looked like he was trapped in a deep and terrible dream. Later that afternoon, a lifelong childhood friend named Obi came to check on her after hearing about Nneoma's death, but the moment his eyes locked onto her glowing face, he became completely breathless and tried to reach out to touch her beautiful hair with trembling hands. When Adanna felt terrified by his strange behavior and pulled away from him, Obi instantly flew into a violent and uncontrollable rage because he could not handle being rejected by her, which proved that her beauty acted exactly like a dangerous cognitive virus that turned normal human admiration into a deadly and uncontrollable obsession. Realizing that she was entirely unsafe and that the people she had known her whole life were turning into mindless monsters just by looking at her, Adanna pushed Obi out of the house and quickly barricaded the heavy wooden door with chairs and tables. She was completely desperate and isolated inside the quiet house, while the sounds of confused villagers began to gather outside her windows, so she began to frantically search through her grandmother's old belongings and weaving baskets to find any kind of explanation for the nightmare that was happening to her. Deep inside the bottom of an old wooden chest covered in dust, Adanna found a hidden journal written in Nneoma's familiar handwriting, and as she flipped through the yellowed pages, she finally learned the dark truth about her identity. The journal explained that their family carried the ancient bloodline of the Siren-Sovereign, which was a powerful and terrifying entity feared by the entire sea, and Nneoma had spent her whole life weaving a magical glamour of ugliness into Adanna's clothes to protect her from the curse, until Nneoma's sudden death broke the spell forever. While Adanna sat trembling on the floor with her grandmother's journal pressed tightly against her chest, a mysterious outsider named Chidi arrived in the middle of the chaotic town without anyone noticing his arrival. Unlike the terrified and confused locals who were wandering around the streets like ghosts, Chidi was able to walk directly toward Adanna's cottage and look straight at her without falling into a helpless trance, because he wore a thick black blindfold over his eyes and navigated his way purely by listening to sound and using supernatural tracking skills. He walked right up to the barricaded cottage and knocked firmly on the wooden door, and when a frightened Adanna finally peeked through a small crack, he calmly revealed that he belonged to an ancient order of warriors that traveled the world to hunt down dangerous magical beings known as the Blighted. He stood on the porch and told Adanna in a serious voice that her sudden transformation was already warping the minds of the entire town, explaining that men and women were completely abandoning their jobs, their children, and their homes just to sit outside her wooden fence in the dirt, hoping to catch a single glimpse of her face. Chidi did not show any pity for her situation, and instead gave her a harsh ultimatum, stating clearly that she must help him perform a ritual to seal the siren curse back into the blank silver mirror immediately, or he would be forced to eliminate her to protect the rest of the world from her dangerous beauty. Knowing that she was completely helpless on her own and that the growing crowd outside would eventually break in, Adanna made a choice to form a tense alliance with the blindfolded hunter, and together they began to secretly prepare for a dangerous journey down to the rocky edge of the sea where Nneoma had first bound the ancient magic many years ago. Before Adanna and Chidi could even step out of the back door to begin their secret journey toward the ocean, the massive crowd of townspeople gathered outside completely lost their remaining senses because they could no longer bear Adanna's long absence from their sight. Driven entirely mad by the cognitive virus of her beauty, the villagers began to scream and smash their bodies against the walls of the small house until the heavy wooden doors split completely open and a sea of desperate people flooded into the cottage. They did not want to hurt Adanna at all, but their obsessive and frantic desire to touch her clothes and possess her form was so overwhelming that they began to violently stomp through the rooms, threatening to tear Chidi to pieces as he tried to defend her with his blindfold still tightly in place. Seeing the blindfolded hunter getting crushed by the mindless crowd and realizing that they would all die if she did not act, Adanna was forced to step forward into the bright light and intentionally unleash the full, terrifying power of her siren beauty upon the mob. She lifted her head high and commanded the crowd to freeze in a voice that sounded like the deep ocean itself, and she watched in awe as every single villager instantly dropped to their knees with hollow eyes, filling her with an intoxicating and terrifying rush of absolute control over human minds before she shook her head and rejected the wicked desire to become a tyrant. Taking advantage of the sudden silence and the frozen crowd, Adanna grabbed Chidi's arm and together they burst through the broken door, sprinting as fast as they could through the dusty streets toward the steep and windy cliffs at the very edge of the village, while the hypnotized townspeople slowly began to wake up from their trance and follow them like a hungry pack of wolves. Standing at the very edge of the steep and windy cliffs where the wild ocean waves crashed loudly against the dark rocks below, Chidi quickly pulled out the blank silver mirror and began to chant the ancient words of the ritual to force the siren curse back into the glass forever. As the air grew cold and the silver mirror began to glow with a strange, swirling light, Adanna suddenly realized the true and heavy cost of the spell that the hunter was performing. Trapping the terrifying beauty back into the mirror meant she would instantly reclaim her old, flawed self with her childhood scars and asymmetric features. But it also meant the magical reversal would completely wipe away every single memory of her grandmother Nneoma's protective weaving and the true history of her family's royal sea lineage. Refusing to live her life in fear, and refusing to let the world forget the incredible sacrifices her grandmother had made to keep her safe for 30 years, Adanna raised her hand and violently shattered the silver mirror against the sharp rocks, instead of letting the curse be trapped inside it. As the broken pieces of silver flew into the deep ocean waters below, Adanna proudly chose to keep her breathtaking appearance and her immense power, and she quickly turned away from her old life to flee into the dark night alongside a surprised Chidi. She looked out at the vast sea and solemnly vowed to learn how to weaponize her siren power against the darker forces that were hunting her lineage, completely transforming from a helpless victim of beauty into a powerful and legendary creature of myth.